Hello, and welcome to Jason's Education Lounge podcast, brought to you by Think Academy. At Think Academy, we make learning across K-12 a fun, creative, and engaging experience. Every episode is a conversation with experts in education and education technology. We talk about learning beyond test scores and provide both educators and parents with solutions that work for their children. I'm your host, Jason. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Jason's Education Lounge. And this week, we have on Guy Schady-Beckett, who is a good friend of mine, who we've met over a year ago, trying to organize the Independent School Show here in the UK, one of the biggest school shows there are in the UK for independent schools. And Guy is someone who's really has had a very long career in the field of education and someone who is very much well regarded with schools, with parents, and also with various different institutions. Guy has a huge passion for data collection, looking at statistics. And we recently just have a chat about how, for example, statistics and results are recorded by state sector and the independent sector. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about here. Because a lot of our parents asked us, for example, education results and rankings, how do they matter? What do they matter? How important are they? And this is something that to a lot of foreign parents is the only information that they can get with regards to British schools. But today, I hope we'll be able to dive into that subject a little bit, maybe on both sectors. So, Guy, would you like to begin by share a little bit about yourself, your career, your journey? Why did you choose education, for example?
Yeah, okay, that's a very interesting question. So my basic career path was that I worked as a journalist initially, and then for various reasons that are too long to go into, I had a brief spell of teaching. And while I was doing that, some of the things that I'd been doing as a journalist became very relevant to the school I was working in. And they were asking me to help them with how they presented themselves to parents and how they communicated with the world. And then what happened was that I then went back to university, this is a long time ago, and learned how to do web design very early on. It was in 1995, so the beginning of the web. And then the two worlds came together, and lots of schools asked me, and universities and different education types of institution asked me to produce websites for them and to help them manage comms and things like that. And one of the things that happened with that was just that I was bringing people statistics about how many people looked at their websites and what people thought of their websites in a way that people had never had numbers before. Like if you send someone a brochure, you don't know what pages they read or whether they even look at it or just throw it in the bin. Whilst with websites, for the first time, people had data about things. And then we were doing lots of other kinds of projects where we were collecting data about what people thought about things, really. And so I got interested in what it was that data does to things, like the social questions or political questions where people didn't have data and then suddenly they do. In parallel with my work, where data became more and more important, as I started doing different things in education, I got more and more interested in the question of what it is that people do with this information.
I see. I mean, I remember you telling me you taught for a while as well.
Yeah, I taught for 6 years, but I didn't teach anything to do with data. I taught English and drama.
Oh, right.
So miles and miles away from data. But I did a history PhD on the question of what happens to people's thinking when they get given statistical information about things. Talked about parents and what they do when they see school rankings, for example. Well, the policymakers, governments, school administrators all have to deal with a world where they're getting a lot of statistical information about their schools or about their university or about their hospital or all sorts of things where people get data about things. And well, you'll see as I talk about it more, but these things don't necessarily make people more rational, which is what people assume. In fact, I would say the opposite.
Yeah. Do you think at the moment, in terms of the state sector, as you mentioned, state schools and private schools, the government would, for example, set the local authority a bar or like a goal where they have to aim for to get specific grades up to that goal?
It's not quite as crude as that. In the UK, the way that government data on education works, and it's something perhaps we could start to dive into in a second, but like what they believe in is transparency. It's like a sort of market between parents and schools. And what governments believe is if you show parents how schools are performing, that they'll make better choices about which schools to choose.
I see.
The target schools are set by Ofsted, not by government. That's the school inspection body. And they wouldn't be as crude as to say your results have to do X, Y, or Z, but they would look at the data as part of their judgment of the school. But it's much more profound than that. They publish all this data so that everyone connected with education can look at it and use it to make judgments. I mean, that might be an interesting place to start, actually, with why that process began.
Yeah, if you could elaborate on the historical context of when the UK began systematically measuring educational performance and why that's the case, that would be very interesting.
What I'm going to do is just share a few slides with you so that you can see what I'm talking about. If you're listening to this and able to look at it, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the latest version of the government's website. It's part of a huge government website that collects together all the government statistics about everything under the sun. But there are masses and masses of education statistics that are published every year by the UK government on many aspects of schools. Those have been basically being published online since almost the beginning of the World Wide Web. So in the late 90s, the government started producing websites that collected together all this data. But the process of collecting data and publishing it is much, much older than that. So what I've got there are the covers of the very earliest reports. So from 1901, there was an annual report by the Board of Education on schools in England and Wales. And that was about 600 pages long and included an enormous amount of data on many aspects of schools and their performance. So this is not a new thing. It's not an internet thing. And because we've been doing it for a long time, you can get these remarkable kind of overviews or long view pictures of what's happened to UK education. So, for example, the pupil-teacher ratio in primary schools, so elementary schools in the UK, has dropped from being about 40 children in a class in 1900 to around 23 in 2010. It's actually gone up a little bit since then. But basically, it's almost halved in size. And this is in the state system. There's been an even bigger drop in the independent system. And then similarly, you can see that different types of schools. So now most secondary schools, most pupils are now in what are called comprehensive schools in the UK. And a small number are in other types of schools. But that was a very different picture. So you can also see how the types of schools that children have attended have changed over a long period of time.
What does it mean by modern? Because I can see technical, comprehensive, grammar modern.
Yeah, that modern was a term used to mean technical education. So before the 1970s, there were grammar schools and what were called secondary modern schools. And you had a test at 11, and some children would go down a technical route, and children who were academic went down a grammar school route.
I see. Okay. That's interesting. It's massively gone down from 1960s to 1985. It's almost stopped existing pretty much.
Yeah. And then the proportion of children in independent schools, which has actually stayed fairly constant. They changed the way they measured it, which is why there's a line in that particular graph. In terms of achievement, again, we can do these very long views. So, for example, the number of students who've got 5 grades A to C at O-level or GCSE has massively increased. The numbers of people going to university, the numbers getting good A-levels has gone up dramatically over the last 30 years, 40 years. One of the things that this kind of data can show you is that there are real changes, real progress that happens in education. And that's something that I think is quite important to remember. I mean, when I was a child, the BBC used to have on Sunday nights, they had a TV program for adults who couldn't read. And that was like a mainstream program at 7:00 in the evening to teach adults who couldn't read how to read. That was because there was a huge population of adults who left school unable to read.
That's very interesting.
And we don't have that anymore. Now almost everyone can read.
This was in the 1970s.
Yeah, this was in the 19th, but this was therefore addressing adults who maybe had been educated in the 1920s or 30s. The point I'm trying to make is that this long view of data shows that On the whole, education standards have improved and class sizes have got smaller. More people pass things, more people go to university. And these are real changes that have been measurable and mean something. And collecting the data on this stuff has helped the schools, heads, policymakers drive resources to get this change to happen.
Yeah.
Just like economic development or other kinds of changes.
You mentioned where the line is. Somewhat they changed the way that they count or changed the way that they measure. If you look at the students obtaining university degrees in the UK in terms of the thousands, in 1994, I see there's a huge line in between and there's a massive gap. Why has that changed so dramatically?
Yeah, so what happened there was that they changed the definition of what counted as a university. So this was a change that came out in the late period of the previous Conservative government. So under John Major, they redefined what used to be called polytechnics as universities. And so therefore there was an instant uplift in the number of people who went to university. And that's a very important thing about the way that data works, that one needs to always understand what's being looked at and what's being counted, because otherwise you're comparing apples and oranges. But then even then, once they'd made that change, the percentage still went up absolutely massively after that.
Yeah. Is there a massive difference between someone who goes to university and polytechnic?
So polytechnics were more vocational.
I see.
So they taught people all sorts of vocational courses like how to manage something or business studies or accountancy, for example. You can do a degree in accountancy now. Up until that period, that wasn't a degree subject. It was just a change in the way that they measured it. But actually, the size of the university sector has grown enormously across all types of institutions. If you were to change the categories back, it would still be going up. You'd have to measure a slightly more complicated thing. But I'm going to take you back a lot further. So we were talking about this way of thinking about education, that in 1900, the British government started collecting and publishing all this data on schools and universities. Well, the British started doing it a lot earlier than that. And what you're looking at there is, I think, I may be proved wrong, but I think this is the oldest set of education statistics in the UK. And this was collected by a religious organisation that created charity schools in Wales and wanted to teach Welsh children how to read. And the reason that they were doing that is that it was Welsh Protestants organised it. And Protestants believe that you can only go to heaven if you've read the Bible and affirm your belief in God. So you have to be able to read to have that individual one-to-one relationship with the Word of God. So Protestants taught a lot of people how to read. And it was a religious act. But the way they set about it, they became printers as well, because they had to print copies of the Bible to give everyone a Bible. So they had a Bible at home. And they had to teach everyone how to read, and they had to raise money to pay for the education and pay for the Bibles. And what they did was they published data on how they were getting along. And so they started collecting data about the number of schools they had in Wales and the number of students that they were teaching how to read. These weren't full-time schools. These were Sunday schools where students were being taught how to read and taught how to read the Bible. And that was how they measured progress. And they thought that meant that more children or more people in the UK were going to heaven if they'd done this process right.
I see.
They used it for fundraising, basically, to give you some money if you showed that you were converting that money into saved souls. What I'm showing you with that is that the idea of measuring and counting educational progress is really old in British culture. But back here in 1738, that's 300 years ago, more or less. That's a long time to not just be collecting this data, but be publishing it. And in publishing it, they're trying to do something, which is collect money from people.
I see. Okay.
The data isn't just some sort of abstract thing. It's like it literally builds the schools. And that's what we're going to be talking about. This way of thinking about what data can do is why the government publishes it and bothers with all this statistical stuff. But a lot of people don't realize that. They think it's just about so that they can judge which school to send their child to or something. It's much more profound than that. It really sets the whole direction of travel in which education goes. We're going to jump forward a bit now. So this data that we're looking at now is also from Wales, and it comes from 1848, but it's 50 years before the government started collecting annual data and publishing annual data. What they did was, in the 19th century, they would every now and then do a big investigation of what was going on in education. They would pour a load of resources in, study it really hard, and produce a great big statistical report. They collected information about all sorts of things. The thing we're looking at now is a table of data on buildings and furniture in Welsh. And it literally is telling you whether the quality of the buildings is good, indifferent, bad, uncertain, whether they are sufficient or insufficient. It tells you the size of buildings in square feet per pupil. And it also tells you about the quality of the furniture and the apparatus for every school. And this is a summary of every school in
Wow.
Wales. And that is literally
Wow.
about deciding whether they need to build new schools or not, or whether they need to upgrade the furniture, and how they spend their money.
Uh-huh.
Now, interestingly,
That's
we'll
pretty
come
cool.
back to this one. It's really cool. And nothing like this exists at the moment in terms of public data. So one of the things I'll be calling for is that we should learn from the 19th century and go, if they could study the quality of buildings built in schools and publish it in the mid-19th century, why can't they now? Because that would tell us something useful and interesting that would help focus resources in the right way. This one is an equivalent survey that was done of English schools. So we've been spending a lot of time in Wales, for all sorts of reasons, had very good early data on education, but we won't dive into the reasons for that. There was similarly a massive report on an inquiry into the state of popular education in England. Now, this was published in 1861, which is, again, a very long time ago. And it's an enormous report. It was a massive activity. It was such an unusual activity that the first sort of like 50 pages of the report, they literally, as you can see on the left, they show the questionnaires that they sent to all the schools and boards of education, because they wanted to show how they were generating the data. So you could literally download all the questionnaires and look at all the questionnaires that people produce. But again, what's fascinating with this one is that they are exploring their definition of what this is before state education. They're just interested in how children are educated. So they look at everything from religious schools, Sunday schools, famous boarding schools, evening schools, part-time schools. They also look at different charities who are running schools and different religious groups. So there are Jewish schools, Church of England schools, Baptist schools. And they look at the numbers of boys and girls in each type of school. And then they look at schools in prisons, at Navy schools, workhouses are where the poor lived. And again, they had their own schools. And then evening schools. So again, there's this massive breakdown. And many children worked and they went to school in the evening. So they did this massive study of every single, and anyone who ran a school had to fill in all these forms and send them back, and they collected all this data. And this was before the government had really started running schools. But what they were trying to do here was get a picture of what on earth was going on and how British children were educated. So it was a really ambitious project. Again, to certain things that I'll come back to in a second, that we don't ask at the moment in the data we collect now. One last thing before I start talking about the present. We're deep in the history at the moment of what was going on. But when we started generating data and publishing it every year, when the government started publishing it every year, it really changed how the press and the media thought about education. So here we're looking at the Times, the English newspaper, in 1912. And they have a whole page on education issues. And one big long article is on shortcomings of English education, i.e. things that they thought the Times think is wrong with English education. And at this stage, the Times is doing a lot of comparative studies with education in Germany, in China, in Russia, France, the US, and they have education correspondents comparing what's going on in each of these places to England. And they understand that if England's going to be a world power, it needs to have a world-class education system. And they also, at this set time, as you see on the right-hand side, they start a thing called the Times Educational Supplement, which is a specialist newspaper that comes out once a week just on education issues. And data, I'm not going to dive into it and make a big point of it, but every article is referencing data. It's like that's how you measure effectiveness and change across different education systems. And this kind of press coverage did not exist in the 19th century. It comes about because of the publication of all this stuff.
Right. Wow. I mean, if you look at the progress that is taken, how were the people's impression of, besides the media pushing them through, how did people react to this data when it was first released to the public?
That's a really interesting question. So in the early days of it being published, the books they weren't bestsellers. I mean, like when the government published a report with 600 pages of education data, it wasn't like most of the population went running out to get a copy. It really wasn't at all like that. But what it meant was that the people who wrote articles in newspapers would get a copy and MPs would look at it. The House of Commons library, for example, is very important, and people don't talk about it very much, but it's a very important aspect of the House of Commons. So all MPs can go and get access to all this information when they're writing a speech about something. They go into the library and they access all the latest reports and data about whatever. So it becomes important in debates. And it means that you've got some benchmarks that can't be argued with.
Yeah. And to go back on the point when you mentioned that it's the churches that used to measure data on number of schools, as I saw, and number of scholars, that's what they call it on the report, to get more people to donate. How much power did the schools actually have in terms of education at that time? How much influence did they have over what schools were teaching, how they were teaching them, etc., etc.?
Did churches have? Almost 100%.
Yeah.
Almost 100%. I mean, schools were almost entirely run by religious organizations. Education was a religious activity.
Is that why a lot of the schools, even nowadays, if you look at, let's say, Teddy's, it's a Christian school. You go to church every Tuesday and Thursday.
Yeah. And even when the state started its own schools, a lot of the time what it did was it just started funding religious schools. Some religious schools stayed private, but a lot of religious schools moved into the state system and became state schools.
I see. So that's the beginning of the independent sector and the state sector.
That's a long, complicated history. But yeah, the first non-religious education organisation in the UK, I think, I may be wrong on this, but is University College London, UCL.
Oh, right.
That was set up in the early 19th century explicitly to be non-religious. It has as one of its things, there isn't allowed to be a church or a chapel on the grounds of UCL. And that was considered very radical indeed.
Gosh, wow.
And they started a school as well, which is now in Hampstead, called UCS, University College School. And again, they had no religious services in the school. Most schools in Britain still have a strong religious side to them. And that plays out in all sorts of ways that are very interesting. But I kind of want to step away from that topic and go right into the present. We've talked a bit about the history, but in a way, who cares about the history? What I think we can do, though, is learn from it. Because I think there are some things about the way the present works where we could really do with learning from what happened in the past. So what I'd like to do is just, in the second half of what we're talking about, is just start throwing some thoughts at you and we can just discuss them and see what we think. But these are things that I think would make education better. So the first thing I'm going to suggest is, for someone who's a web developer, is a really odd one, but the government publishes an enormous amount of data these days. It's really complicated to get on top of it. And I work with this data the whole time. I'm always discovering things I didn't know in it. It's not easy to make sense of and process. I mean, not at all. Much harder than the old annual reports. And also, it all comes out at different times. So the GCSE results get updated at a certain time of year, A-levels at another time of year, the characteristics of pupils in schools, what kind of backgrounds they are, what kind of ethnicity, their wealth, all those kind of things, all come out at different times of the year. And it means that it's very hard to get an overview. So I think what they should do is go back to publishing an annual report that comes out once a year that sets the key agenda. It says, these are the things we're trying to change. This is how we're getting on. These are the topics that we're worried about. I think that would really help the debate and would mean that all this data that's being published can actually do something rather than just sit there. It's almost got too complicated the way they do it now. So it's brilliant if you're a complete data nerd like I am, but actually it's impossible for anyone outside that narrow world to make sense of. And I think that would just transform how we debated education. The next one I've already talked about. In the 19th century in Wales, they could survey the whole of Wales and provide data on the quality of buildings and facilities. But there is no data that does that now for UK schools. And I'm sure that the Department for Education has data on these things about the schools that it manages, because we know about things like the problems with concrete, and they probably know the size of playing fields and the size of schools, different types of schools and so on, but they don't make it public. And actually, I think it matters. I think it matters for parents thinking about sending their child to an inner city primary school that's in a very constrained site. It would be interesting to see how that compared in terms of academic results with the school in the suburb that's got big playing fields and so on. So I think it would help parents, it would help government decide where to spend money, and it would probably lead to changes in provision. There are huge differences in what children have at school. And this is true across all types of schools. Like there are children in private schools in central London where they're crammed into tiny buildings. And then there are children that have acres of grounds. And I think we should be making that public. I think it's something that would help parents when they're choosing schools, and it would help us decide whether we need to build new ones, or it would create a useful debate. I don't think that's very controversial. I think that's a really straightforward one. The next one is something that's so odd that this probably would not have occurred to you. Because, well, maybe as a non-UK citizen, this may or may not have hit you as an issue. But there's a really peculiar thing in the UK that we are one country, but we're four. So there's England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And we endlessly have debates about nationalism. And most of the English political parties are very against the idea that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland become their own things. But there's a lot of areas where we don't provide common data. So, for example, we have never published education data across the whole of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So even things like how much is spent per school, per child, we can't compare what happens in Scotland, England, Wales, or Northern Ireland. That's completely mad. And it means you can't get a proper overview of the UK. And English parents can't complain about the state of what they're offered versus Scottish parents. And I think politically that's a problem because there are big differences. It's not like if they're all doing the same thing, that would be fine, but they're not. So I just think that it would be a simple change. There would be certain things about it where you'd be having to be saying, well, they're not the same. Well, this thing is different or that thing is different. But certain things like class sizes or the quality of the buildings or the different ethnic makeup of schools or all that kind of stuff is totally comparable. And the fact that they do slightly different subjects is irrelevant, I think. So that would be, if I was Secretary of State for Education in England with a massive majority now, that would be thing number one that I would do. It would mean that I could see what was going on.
Do you feel the concern here might be that the government would be afraid of taking powers away from the devolved administrations? Because, of course, that's a very sensitive issue. And this time, if you look at this general election that just went past, there are actually a lot of Labour votes in Scotland as well. Labour votes in Wales. I mean, Wales is run by a Labour government. If they were to take power away, essentially, I mean, reintegrating would probably mean taking power away from the devolved administrations. It would be an issue.
You've hit the nail on the head on why it doesn't happen. I'm not sure. I think that what you would do is create quite a small, higher body that enabled the different part of the four nations to learn from each other and compare things with each other. Most of the power will be lower down, but just to be able to say, okay, we're spending money in this way and it's having this effect on how we teach maths or this effect on the quality of our after school provision. We spend a lot of time learning from other countries, going off and looking at how they teach in Finland or what's happening in schools in China. This is something that educationists think about the whole time. And yet here we have a system where we could easily learn the whole time from each other, but we make it really difficult. I mean, you can bring the data together, but it's not easy in the way it's published. It would be a relatively trivial thing to bring it together from a statistical point of view. As long as you call things the same things, underline them a bit, it wouldn't be very difficult. And I think it would help. In terms of my desire for a UK overview, I'm then going to get a bit radical because that one strikes me as like these are government state statistics. There's 4 sets of them, bring them together. But there's a load more data that is not in the system that really, I think, really should be. And the first and really big one is that independent schools don't have their data in the system, although they have a little bit of it. So there are certain things that they are obliged to put in, but there are many things that they don't. What's interesting about that is that the Independent Schools Council collects a lot of data. It's very useful. They publish a census every year that I use the whole time, but it's nothing like the fine grained information that you can get from the state system. I mean, miles away. And yet they've all trained it the same way. They would easily be able to provide the same information. It's not that burdensome. Every school in the country does it. Every little tiny primary school supplies the correct data for the government. And yet independent schools don't. And so I think that's a huge, obvious failing. I can see all sorts of reasons why they might say they didn't want to do it. What I would suggest is, I mean, personally, I'd go a bit hardcore and make it compulsory. But if that was politically unacceptable, then I think you could say something like, if you want to keep charitable status, for example, then you have to take part. Something like that.
I mean, it's very difficult because it is something that as a company we'd have to deal with as well. If a parent asks you about a school, I think there's only 2 or 3 data you can go off of. Number 1 is the Oxbridge admissions rate. What's the percentage of the pupils that end up at Oxbridge? Number 2 is the GCSE or A-level results of the independent schools that do publish those results. I know there's a huge amount that don't actually publish those results. If you look at the league tables, that's how they rank it, based on the A-levels GCSE results. But that is such a narrow way to rank school.
It's mad. I see why commercially they don't want to do it, but I don't think it helps parents. I don't think it helps choosing schools. I don't think it helps people evaluate the differences between state and independent. And I think it would actually benefit independent schools. I think they'd be nervous about it. They need a lot of hand-holding to say, look, it's going to be all right. You're going to be a lot more public. You're removing all the veils around this information. For example, you cannot tell class size in independent schools. While for state schools, they have to publish the class size of every year group. I think that would be really helpful. It would just be another way that you could think about the differences between the systems. And in the 19th century, when they sent out their surveys, they didn't leave anyone out. It was compulsory, and every school had to take part. I don't really know why we've stepped away from that. So it would really help parents, but also politicians, government, Department of Education, school inspectors, compare schools. I would then go wider than that. I would go back to that 19th century book we were looking at, where it was looking at after-school care, evening schools, Sunday schools in prisons. And I would say that we need to look at every place where learning happens for children. So whether that's tuition centres, youth clubs, sports clubs, music schools, religious schools, all of the holiday clubs, wraparound care, all of those things should be asked to produce some basic information about the education that they're providing. Whether or not we choose to inspect them, we should know what's going on.
This cuts really close to home because it is something that I'm massively involved in terms of tuition centers, youth clubs. I mean, for us, it'll be great because then we can show off about all of our 11 plus, 13 plus results. But for many others, probably, I don't know what the circumstances are. The thing that gets to me is somehow there isn't a regulatory body that regulates centers to make sure that there's a certain level of teaching. Because if you look at all the services, all the products, the food that you eat, the computers that you use, even the plug sockets, they all have to go through some sort of government regulating body. But the tuition centers is so unregulated. You can literally be anyone and you can be a tutor, you can teach, and it's completely legal. You have to have a license to be a driving instructor, but you can just be anybody and you can teach. I mean, there's so many cases that we saw where someone who has no experience in teaching, no training whatsoever, that's taken hundreds of thousands of pounds from parents and has taught their children in a really wrong way. And there's nothing the parents can do about it because there's no regulation. Essentially, there's no protection for consumers in this case in terms of teaching.
Couldn't agree with you more. And one thing that I meant to put down on my list of things you could measure if you started doing this was qualifications of staff. So, for example, private schools, when they publish staff lists, put qualifications, where teachers went to university, what kind of degree they've got, things like that. That's not really counted in the state system properly at the moment. And I would definitely have that for all kinds of education. How many adults you employ, what qualifications they have, but just the sum. And that would be very interesting. It isn't necessarily the case that great education always happens with masses and masses of incredibly well-qualified people. But it's just interesting to see how different organizations run themselves. It provides useful information for everybody, and it means you can evaluate different ways of doing things. So with data often comes regulation. The two go hand in hand. Once you start collecting information about things, you can start putting rules in place. I've got on the right-hand side of this kind of wish list some of the gains that I think we get if we brought together this sort of comprehensive study. What I'm calling for is UK-wide data, independent schools, and then every other scenario where education of children happens alongside school, so that we get a proper overall picture of education of children in the UK. I think whilst it seems incredibly ambitious, we were able to do it in the middle of the 19th century by sending out paper questionnaires. So it's not actually that complicated.
Yeah.
It can be done. We did it before. It wouldn't be very difficult to make it happen. If we were able to do this, the first thing that I think we could do is we could look at school expenditure per pupil and relate that to performance. Now, I mean, I'm going to just flip forward and show you what we can do at the moment. So this is data from currently published government data. This data that I've pulled out of the system, but this is all publicly available. I've just summarized it into a handy kind of like table. And spending per pupil is very different in different kinds of schools. I don't think parents really realize this, actually, just how much it varies. The least well-resourced schools are community schools. Those are council-funded state schools, and they've historically had the least amount of funding in recent years for all sorts of political reasons.
That wraps up this episode of Jason's Education Lounge podcast. A shout out to our parent company, Think Academy, a company that provides world-class online and in-person education programs for K-12 students. We're proud to be different, result-driven, and focused on the specific learning needs of your child. Check out our website at www.thinkacademy.uk. And a big shout out to Fame for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening, folks. Stick around for more insights in our next episode. Catch you later.